After the end of the ceasefire on July 1, 2014, the armed forces of Ukraine, together with various volunteer formations, began a full-scale offensive. On July 4 to 5th, the occupants left Slovyansk, Kramatorsk and the neighboring settlements with the threat of being surrounded and laid siege to. On July 6th, Trushkivka, Konstantinivka and Bakhmut were liberated. The fact of the smooth liberation of the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration with almost no destruction boosted the morale of the army and gave its commanders more confidence. Civilians got hope that all this nonsense in the east of the country would end soon. Every day, the names of settlements that were newly liberated by the Ukrainian army were posted on the internet and announced in the mass media. This is the film about the ATO, the history of war. We're trying to understand the course of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, its causes and results. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? And how does the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia pose a threat to Europe? It was like a breath of fresh air after a long dive. And the average person in the street did not want to think about the fact that it was just a warm-up or that the real war was still ahead and, in fact, was just flaring up. Headquarters of the ATO left the dusty area near Izum. Having moved to the airfield of Kramatorsk, the generals unfolded new maps and drew new arrows. Meanwhile, the Russian-backed forces were regrouping, receiving new weapons, and, in attempt to stop the advance of the Ukrainian troops, blowing up bridges. Disregarding the basic needs and safety of average citizens, the terrorists were actively destroying major infrastructure facilities. As of July 22nd, one way or another, 13 bridge crossings were severely damaged. One of the first on July 4th, the bridge across the Seversky Donets River in the village of Chorhizbenka in the Luhansk Oblast was blown up. That led to the isolation of the settlement from the outside world, seen as the distance to Severodonetsk around the bridge was 100 kilometers. The situation with the delivery of supplies or calling an ambulance was greatly complicated. On July 6th, in the territory of the Kherson Oblast, Volodymyr Kovalchuk, an ally of the terrorist leader Gherkin, was detained during an attempt to escape to Crimea. It should be noted that the special services of Russia launched an active recruitment campaign on the territory of the peninsula. They were training militants and teaching them how to handle weapons and explosives. Consequently, 2 such militants were apprehended on July 7th in the Kharkiv Oblast. Their main goal and tasks were to organize and commit acts of terrorism. On the same day, at about 1 p.m., the Russian-backed troops blew up a bridge along the Novobakhmutivka-Ocheretyane railway line. A train was moving along the bridge at the time of the explosion, but fortunately enough, there were no casualties. The bridge across the Seversky Donets River in the Liman-Bakhmut-Horlivka highway was also seriously damaged. This episode did not prevent the ATO forces from liberating the nearby city of Siversk and moving closer to the city of Lysychansk by July 10th. However, the actions of the army in this area were limited by the proximity to the Lysychansk oil refinery. The situation was aggravated by the fact that special heavy rescue vehicles were confiscated by the Russian-backed troops. Thus, on the night of July 18th, the militants using MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, shot the territory of the refinery. Due to the lack of the aforementioned vehicles, putting out the fire turned out to be a difficult task. MLRS multiple launch rocket system, characterized by high performance and suddenness of strike since it shoots volley fires. Due to high dispersion, it has mediocre accuracy. It is effective against infantry without cover and groups of vehicles. MLRS are fired not at a specific target, but at an area where the target is located. The military call them heavy artillery strikes. Back on July 9th, in the area of the village on the border of Dmitrivka, the Ukrainian army destroyed 2 BM-21 installations, better known as Hrad missiles. It is important to understand one nuance. This vehicle fires volleys of 20 to 40 missiles, and each one costs, depending on the modification, from $400 to $1,000. question arises, who's paying for the banquet? There was not a single ammo depot in the territory controlled by the Russian-backed troops, and the version broadcast by Russian television about allegedly recovered equipment and ammunition is bursting at the seams in this context. In theory, the Russian-backed forces could capture one or two faulty vehicles, but BM-21s go through large amounts of missiles, literally train cars loaded with them, so they must have been supplied from the outside. Just looking at the map suffices to figure this out. There's only one country that manufactures such missiles and has a lot of them in its warehouses borders with the DPR and LPR, namely Russia. Nevertheless, the tactics of liberating large settlements by surrounding and blocking them have shown their effectiveness. By watching over the border crossings and destroying the vehicles that tried to break through the border, the Ukrainian army prevented the terrorists from being supplied with ammunition. The armed forces and volunteer units were slowly advancing along the so-called Army of the New Russia, pushing them out of cities and villages. The situation of the pro-Russian militants worsened with each passing day. So in order to restore the delivery of militants and ammunition, the Russian leadership resorted to the following maneuver. Artillery units of the Russian army deployed along the border with Ukraine. Under the guise of artillery exercises, they began to fire at the positions of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians visually observed the volleys, but they could not suppress the Russian artillery, since firing at the territory of the Russian Federation would have been an excellent precept for an invasion of Ukraine. On July 11th, the field camp of the Ukrainian 24th Brigade near the village of Zelenopillya was fired upon. The enemy chose an opportune moment for the attack, as convoys of the 72nd and 79th Brigades gathered at the camp to further block the state border. Adjusting the fire with the help of an Orlan-10 UAV, Russian artillery executed a massive shelling. Subsequently, as a result of independent investigation of the fact, it was found that at 4:30 the camp was hit by a combined volley of 14 combat vehicles, which amounts to a total of 560 missiles. As a result of the attack, 37 military personnel were killed, more than 100 people were injured, and a large amount of equipment was burned. The attack near Zelenopillya was the first incident of the massive firing of Russian artillery. Afterwards, such attacks became more systematic and continued daily until the middle of August 2014. On July 13th, the combined unit of Sector A forces advanced to reinforce Ukrainian positions at the Luhansk airport. After the destruction of the bridge in the village of Krasny Luch, Mamusheve since 2016, on July 7th, the bridge in this area across the Luhan River had become a strategically important object. The only such acting bridge remained in the neighboring village of Sabivka. To preserve it, the village was taken under control. With the support of artillery, the combined unit made its way to the airport and significantly strengthened its garrison. However, those measures did not solve the problem, as in conditions of a hot summer, water basically became the most important resource, which was being consumed very quickly in 40-degree heat. To solve the problem, the command decided to create a land corridor to the airfield. On the same day, the terrorists blew up a bridge near Kharkiv, allegedly to prevent Ukrainian troops from advancing to Savur-Mahela. The next day, as part of the organization of the land corridor to the Luhansk airport and the surroundings of the city of Luhansk, the armed forces liberated the settlements of Metallist, Alexandrivsk, Byle, and Roskishne. A Ukrainian transport aircraft An-26, which supplied water and food to the troops at the state border, was shot down above Krasnodon. Of the 8 crew members, 2 were killed, 5 were rescued by special forces search groups, and the pilot Serhiy Mordvinov was taken prisoner and then was exchanged after 2 months. Seeking to influence the morale of the Ukrainian military as well as to aggravate panic among society, the terrorists recorded the interrogation of the pilot and posted it on the internet. A prisoner would say anything to save their life. This is a normal phenomenon, and soldiers in many armies of the world are taught to survive in captivity. The Russians, on the other hand, used the standard propaganda method to force the prisoner to rescind the oath or to slander themselves. The fact that the soldier was threatened with weapons at the time is not usually a fragment in such video recordings. The propaganda of the Russian Federation tried to break the morale of the Ukrainian military in every possible way, as well as to instill the myth of the invincibility of the Russian army and the futility of resistance. Mass media disseminated false evidence of the enormous losses on the Ukrainian side, sometimes overestimating the figures by more than 10 times. Moreover, Russian journalists did not put much effort to being accurate with the classification of the subdivisions. They called any more or less organized units the National Guard, regardless of whether it was the police or the army. Every other unit that could not be easily defined they called the right sector. That introduced a certain level of confusion in the information field. Intentionally juggling with words, the federal propaganda often exaggerated the successes of Russian terrorist forces. At the same time, not a word had been said about the support of militants with Russian human resources and military hardware. When covering the aforementioned shelling near Zelenopillya, the fake chroniclers declared the complete destruction of the 24th Brigade. But the fact that the brigade consisted of over 2,000 soldiers and its tactical groups operate all over the ATO zone was modestly omitted by those journalists, if they can be called that. Every slightest mistake of the Ukrainian command was discussed into oblivion in the Russian news releases. The army is a large organism and flaws can be found in it at any time. Every smallest episode of desertion, drunkenness, or disobedience was inflated in every possible way. To intimidate the local population, the federal television channels kept screaming about the alleged war crimes of Ukrainian security forces, one louder than the other. A correlation became obvious. The more effective a unit became at fighting back the Russian-backed forces, the more Russian media tried to attribute these fabricated sins to its soldiers. So on July 12th to 13th, a story was aired on the Russian Channel 1. In it, a refugee from Slavyansk, Galina Pishnyak, claimed that ostensibly the soldiers executed the young son and wife of a militiaman. The report incited serious public resonance. As it turned out, such information had already been published on social media several days prior to that. However, the propagandists outplayed themselves in that case. Parallel investigations were conducted. Both Ukrainian and Russian journalists, independently of each other, proved that the statement was absolutely false, and the only true fact in the report was the name of the so-called refugee whose husband joined the terrorist group of Igor Girkin. In the end, Russian journalists turned to Yulia Chumakova, the head of the South Russian Bureau of Channel 1 and the author of the scandalous plot, for comments and details, but she flatly refused to give any explanation. This and many other similar stories are nothing more than an attempt to stir up ethnic hatred between Russians and Ukrainians. Showing false reports on the Central Television channel was neither a mistake nor a miscalculation. It was a deliberate attempt to demonize the Ukrainian military, so there's nothing surprising about that. If you hate your enemy, it's easier to fight them. Similar techniques were used in all wars of the 20th century. Taking into account the events that happened later, we can confidently claim that Russian television was preparing the population of their country for the invasion. July 16th, video clips appeared on the internet which clearly shown Hrad MRLS firing volleys towards Ukraine. Also in the area of the settlements Marinivka, Stepanivka and Ambrosivka, the forces of the so-called Donbass People's Militia began their attack. Their assault was supported by the Russian military personnel and artillery that was shooting across the border. On July 17, 2014, at 12:30 Kyiv time, a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 was getting ready to take off from the Schiphol airport on the route Amsterdam-Kuala Lumpur. The fate of this aircraft is widely known.